Welcome to the Catalyst Podcast, brought to you by Chestnut Health Systems. I'm your host, Charles Epstein. Today, we're delighted and honored to be joined by Dr. Leslie Korn, PhD, MPH, an integrative medicine clinician, scientist, educator, and author who specializes in the intersection of mental health and chronic physical illness. Dr. Korn has been in clinical practice for over 40 years. She is a licensed psychotherapist, functional nutritional practitioner, board certified in polarity therapy and massage therapy, and is a board certified clinical supervisor. By the way, there's more. So buckle in. There's more. I think we are breaking the land speed record on intros in the Catalyst podcast. So we are making history here today. She is a PhD in applied psychophysiology and behavioral medicine, an MPH from Harvard School of Public Health, an MA in cross-cultural health psychology, and was a clinical fellow in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, where she introduced somatic therapies for mental health in 1985. She was a Fulbright Scholar in Traditional Medicine of Mexico and an NIH-funded scientist in mind-body medicine. She is a research director at the Center for World Indigenous Studies, where she directs the traditional medicine and indigenous food projects. And if that's not all, she is the author of 10 books. And as we work our way through this conversation, there is yet more to uncover about the extraordinary Dr. Leslie Korn. Leslie, thanks so much for joining me. I really do appreciate this.
My pleasure, Charles.
And you are speaking to us from where?
I'm in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico right now.
How nice. And you've been there for how long?
I arrived here in 1973.
By way of?
Oh, by way of a long bus ride on a school bus. But I arrived from Boston.
Wow. Very nice. That's a long period of time to be spending down there. So let me ask you, what was the original catalyst that drew you to focusing on the connection between nutrition and mental health?
Well, I think I really began my studies of nutrition when I did land in the jungle of Mexico here on the West Coast. I'm in the city right now, but for several decades I lived south of here in small indigenous communities, and where I lived and worked and started a health center. And when I first arrived, the public health system was fairly limited. There were no doctors. Where I lived, there were no roads, no running water to speak of, no nursing, no electricity. So it was very rural. And it was at a time, certainly back in the early 70s, when there was a lot of infectious disease. And so I was very lucky to get sick with everything. And that was my catalyst for learning about how to stay healthy. And the way to stay healthy in rural communities, and I think still is, whether we're rural or urban, is through the use of nutrition, the use of foods and herbs and the kinds of things that nature has given us. So that was my introduction to nutrition. And over the years, as my practice evolved and as my studies evolved, both with local herbalists and curanderas, with healers and shamans, and then when I went back to do formal training at the university, studying mental health and a variety of these different disciplines, I always came back to nutrition because it was really the fuel. It was really the energy that fueled our brain and our mind. And what I found is it was always the missing piece in the treatment plan, whether we were doing psychotherapy, whether we were treating GI problems or heart health, chronic stress or trauma, PTSD. The nutrition was missing. And so that's what led me to really emphasize nutrition for mental health.
I know your practice is global, but what I'd like to ask is, how has people's perceptions about the connection between nutrition and mental health changed over the past 5-10 years?
I think it's changed a lot for many people, and I think it's still stagnant for others. I think it's around access to knowledge and information, and then access to be able to make the changes. So I do think that many people are now paying attention to the fact that what we eat affects how we feel, how we sleep, our stress levels, our pain levels, really how we feel as whole human beings. I think many people are still subject, though, to the kind of propaganda and what I call social dissociation of media. And the reason I say this is because while my practice tends to attract people who are fairly sophisticated in their knowledge, I also attract people who say to me, how come I never knew that this was possible? How come I never knew that this approach existed? So I think we're still living with, in many ways, two tiers of knowledge and two tiers of access. One is growing awareness about the relationship between nutrition and mental health, and then still people who, for a variety of reasons, don't have access.
So I mentioned that your practice is global. Can you give us an idea of who you typically consult?
Sure. I have both a private clinical practice and I also have a pro bono practice because I wear two hats. One is as a private practice clinician, and the other is directing a nonprofit where our commitment is to provide care for people who have food insecurity or who otherwise couldn't afford integrative care. Indeed, I belong to a group called Integrative Medicine for the Underserved. So I have a foot in two worlds. And in general, I work with people who have chronic exposure to trauma, perhaps PTSD due to interpersonal violence or war, exposure to explosive devices, and therefore have traumatic brain injury and PTSD. People with chronic exposure who have complex trauma, who grew up with chronic adverse childhood event exposures. And these individuals, by and large, have very complex physical and emotional distress. So, depression, anxiety, insomnia, often chronic pain, substance abuse, or in recovery from substance abuse of some kind, and maybe who've tried everything, who've tried a lot of medications without success or with side effects and who are unhappy with those side effects. People who are looking for another approach to restoring their health and well-being. And I would say it's divided half and half between men and women. And I also see a lot of parents who are under pressure to put their children on medication for the diagnosis of ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder, who resist that, who don't want to do that. And so these are people who are looking for alternatives.
How is your client base distributed?
I work with three broad types. I work a lot with people in the United States. I work with a lot of professionals who themselves are interested in this work. So they're working on themselves, their own health, their own recovery, what we call the wounded healer, people that are also interested in doing this work professionally. I work with a lot of Mexican Americans, and I work with a lot of Mexicans, and I work with indigenous populations in Mexico and the Pacific Northwest United States in particular.
Okay, and I'm assuming most of your work, say, in the United States is virtual.
Yes, most of my work, most places, is virtual. Yeah. I see people in Europe and in Canada as well, but mostly the United States.
I see. So I asked you about the perceptions about the connection between nutrition and mental health and how it's changed. We always hear about diets, nutrition here in the United States versus other parts of the world, and our diets are not very good. They're not very healthy. How do you describe that? And as far as this perception, is there a growing perception about that here in the States, or is that still sort of an upward climb, still kind of a slog getting people to understand this connection?
I think there's absolutely growth in this area. We call it the SAD diet, the standard American diet. And there's an absolute growing perception. In many ways, I liken it to where we were with tobacco 30 years ago. There's an awareness of the danger of refined foods and refined sugar in particular, which, if we were going to encapsulate the poison in our diet, that's where it sits, along with the processed and poor quality oils. I think that's where we have our work to do. And so, in many ways, we've done a lot of work around tobacco. Now, our job is really to educate and support and actually enact laws, I think, about these poisonous foods. So, it's growing. And I think what we're seeing globally is an awareness. I think Europe, many countries in Europe tend to be a little bit further ahead of us. I think there are many countries, let's say India and Africa, even here in Mexico and South America, where we're not that far from the awareness of traditional food diets, of the original or authentic foods that are endemic to the region. And so, in many parts of the world, we're not as far away. We don't have that SAD diet. But where we do have a SAD diet, we're seeing an uptick in diabetes, let's say in China and India, in parts of Africa. So, we've got a variety, if we're going to expand our awareness globally. We've got very specific issues going on in different countries and different regions.
This may be somewhat anecdotal, but anytime you travel abroad, particularly Europe, or anytime I hear friends of mine or colleagues coming back, they always remark about the freshness of the food. It seems that so many of the ingredients are locally sourced. The olive oil is real olive oil, right? And it's just so very different. It's uh,
Yes.
it's a completely different eating experience between here and there. I wanted to talk to you about the food as medicine market, which is an evolving sector where nutrition is integrated into clinical care to prevent, manage, and treat chronic diseases. And did a little bit of research on this in preparation for this. And the market is projected to grow to 11.5 billion by
Mm.
2031, which is amazing. What is driving this?
I think people are unhappy with their food. They're unhappy with chronic illness. I mentioned infectious disease in Mexico in the 80s. We came through a period of infectious disease globally, and we certainly have areas of the globe that still deals with infectious disease. But now, primarily, we deal with chronic illness, which is driven primarily by lifestyle, by the fact that we're eating the kinds of foods we're eating, the SAD diet, and we're sedentary. Those are perhaps the two main drivers of the fact that people are ill, they don't feel well, and they recognize that there's no medication for it in particular. And I think people are interested in prevention and keeping themselves from getting sick rather than treating it with a pill, which often won't help by the time you are sick. So I think, as with all social change, it's being driven by the consumer and the demand by the consumer. And that's why we see food as medicine, culinary medicine courses cropping up in medical schools and in university teaching clinics and herbal medicine programs in university clinics. And we're just seeing a vast engagement here because of that dissatisfaction with the delivery
Mm.
of care.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. A personal anecdote. About 3 years ago, my doctor, all of my numbers were kind of wonky and off, and he was pushing me to do a vegan diet. He himself is a vegan, and he recommended a book. And I looked at this and I put it aside. I can't do this. So 3 months later, I told him, he looked at me like I had two heads. What do you mean you can't do this? It's so easy and you'll feel better. So I said, okay. 3 months later, I came, I said, I tried, can't do it. And again, he pushed me. So finally, I really decided to commit to it. And what I found is, and it was kind of interesting because I have one really good friend who's been a vegan for years and years. And he was a vegan when it was not easy to be a vegan. But then I realized as the more I got into it, it's become a lot easier. You go to restaurants and they have a V for vegan for items on the menu. You can get Impossible burgers. It's a lot easier to shift your diet. And eventually I did. I had since sort of moved into a little bit more pescatarian
Hmm.
diet, but I found it ultimately, it did make me feel better. My numbers improved, cholesterol, this, that, and the other. My iron was down, and I was able to get those numbers up. But I started to really enjoy it. It felt like it was a creative undertaking. It really got me into food, think more intentionally about what I'm eating, understand what I'm eating. So it wasn't, it became almost like a hobby,
Hmm.
a creative undertaking. And so I've been something of a evangelist for that, just short of being obnoxious and annoying.
Oh,
But
very good. That's good to hear.
yes, yes.
Well, I have a saying. It's not my saying, but I repeat it. It's called "The kitchen is your pharmacy." And I think if we look at foods, if and we look at the colors of foods, the range of colors reflect the range of nutrients and healing chemicals. And if we think about having a broad range of foods and the colors, we're going to get a lot of the medicines, a lot of the healing elements that we need for our bodies. I will say, I have a little bit more a nuanced view on veganism because working globally, you realize that veganism might be good for some people, like you tried it short term for some period of time, but it's not going to be right for everyone. And that is the idea of bioindividuality, that, for example, an Inuit person who evolved genetically and environmentally in the Arctic with a lot of fat and a moderate amount of protein and very low carbohydrates would die if they had a vegan diet. Their body didn't evolve to have that kind of a diet. So I think the one thing that I try to share with my students, for example, is there's no one right diet for everyone. Some people will do very well on a carnivore diet. Some people do very well on a vegetarian diet, and many people are very adaptable and can do somewhere in between.
That's an excellent point. Leslie, you developed an evidence-based approach called the Brain Bow Blueprint. For our listeners, what is this blueprint? What problems does it solve? How does it work?
I was mentioning all the colors of the rainbow, what I call the brainbow.
Ah,
These, what I discovered is most of my patients did not care to listen to me talk about vitamin A or vitamin C or vitamin D or B vitamins. But when I talked about eating all the colors of the rainbow, so that's where the word came from, they could identify with that, picking out red and green and purple and white and all of that when they went shopping in terms of foods. But the Brainbow model developed really out of the disciplines in which I trained. I began as a body worker that took me into the study of psychology and psychotherapy, along with nutrition and herbal medicine and naturopathic medicine and psychophysiology. And so what I began to see is that there was not just one approach, one method that helped someone, nor did everyone want to do the same thing. if you knew that a client or a patient needed to exercise and they said, no, don't talk to me about exercise, but I'll change my diet, then you have to be light on your toes and say, let's work with this and hopefully come around when they're feeling better to exercise. And so the Brainbow model reflects 17 different approaches that I think are integral and essential to really addressing the whole health of someone.
You mentioned, your work with people experiencing PTSD and complex trauma. I'm curious, what happens biochemically to a person experiencing trauma, and how can targeted nutrition effectively address that?
It certainly depends on whether you have a one-time exposure to trauma or repeated exposures. Some of the most interesting research around the psychobiology of trauma came out of the study of Holocaust survivors and their offspring, because one of the things that was looked at was the stress response. And in response to trauma, overwhelming event, what happens is we begin to behaviorally and biochemically shift wildly in our responses. We overreact, we become hypersensitive, hypervigilant, that proverbial hearing a pin drop making you jump, to numb, to dulled, to response, to being hypoactive, that kind of lethargy and depression. And then we can swing wildly between those states behaviorally in our interactions with people. But those also have biochemical states that are often driven by our stress hormones. And one of the things, some of the early wonderful research that was done by Dr. Yehuda was looking at Holocaust survivors who were so spent, who had spent all of the stress hormones, who really had nothing to left anymore. They weren't in a state of hyperactivity. They weren't in a heightened state of stress. They were simply worn out and worn down. And that manifested in early morning depression, early morning fatigue. And the brilliance of the research is that that was passed on through the nervous system to the offspring. And so we began to see these kinds of symptoms, both behaviorally and biochemically, in the offspring. Now, that's been expanded into all kinds of populations. And we certainly see this in people who have had long-term exposure. I'll give you an example. Many of us have been caregivers of our parents or elders or maybe children, in the sense of needing extraordinary care. And in the early years of caregiving, our stress response is high. We wake up, we are vigilant, we're raring to go, we have work to do. Over time, we become worn out. Now, that wearing out is more than just a burnout experience. That is becoming physiologically worn out, where cortisol drops, where our hypothalamic pituitary axis becomes dysregulated, where we can't sleep very well. And that happens over the chronicity of caring. And we see this then in the chronicity of trauma and the chronicity of traumatic stress. And so our work is really to restore the system. I use the metaphor of the engine, that in order to fuel the brain, to fuel the engine, we have to feed it the right fuel. And it goes back to our Inuit patients, that they need fuel that's a lot of fat and a lot of meat, but some people need a lot of vegetables and fruits and grains and legumes. But the idea is that when we're looking at this worn down engine, aka the brain and our immune system and our heart and our digestion, all of that needs to be fueled with real authentic nutrients, not packages filled with ingredients that we can't pronounce, but really the fuel that Mother Nature gave us, And that is the authentic fuel of our ancestors that we use to fuel ourselves today.
Yeah, that's fascinating. This past January, you released the second edition of your book, Nutrition Essentials for Mental Health, a guide to quote unquote the food mood connection. What gaps were you trying to fill for both clinicians and everyday readers when you wrote it? And then I'm going to ask you, because I know the original was published in 2016, what you updated in the intervening 10 years. But first, what was the impetus for writing it?
Well, as a psychotherapist, what I saw the missing link for mental health is nutrition. And I really wanted to give clinicians a way to integrate nutrition and also to dispel the myths, to give them something to work with, and to understand how personality affects nutrition. We've all had the experience of going to a clinician, or maybe you go to a trainer or a dietitian or whomever you go to, and they tell you what to do, kind of like your doctor told you what to do, and you went, oh, yeah, yeah, I can't do it. But that's a lot about personality too. And no one right size fits everyone in motivating people. And so I wanted to bridge the gap where clinicians understood what is nutrition for mental health. I have a saying, nutrition is biology, it's not ideology. So it's not what we think, it's not our belief system, it's not a religion. It's what our body needs for fuel, and all of our bodies are different. So I wanted to dispel and cut through all this noise that we hear in media all the time about the latest and the greatest fad. And then I wanted to give people action items, how to understand what changes to make, what's most important, what's easiest to change first, where you'll get your most benefits, and to understand supplementation and dosing, and then to understand how we motivate to change and how that varies across our different personalities.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, this idea that you want to separate this from any ideological framework, because these days everything is so politically charged and people tend to resist any kind of message if there is a perception that there's an agenda attached to it. So removing that or preempting that notion and saying, look, it's pure biology. That's what this message is all about. And also consistent with your message generally is no one size fits all.
Yeah, and I think also having compassion for ourselves and understanding that change is not easy. I always encourage my students who are clinicians to they better be their own laboratory. We better be working on ourselves, because then you realize change is hard, and it gives us compassion and empathy and insight into how hard it is for our patients. It's why I love, I'm sorry when a cardiologist has a heart attack, but we've read plenty of stories when they do. It wakes them up to realize how to be even better at their work, because now they understand what it means to be the patient.
Yeah, for sure. This is not an exact analogy to this, but a number of years ago, I experienced for about 24 hours what I later found out was an anxiety attack, and it was awful.
Mm.
I haven't experienced it since. I never experienced it before, but I look at it as something of a blessing because now I know what that means. I know what that feels like.
Hmm.
And I am deeply empathetic to anybody who grapples with that on any kind of basis, so experiencing something is nothing that teaches you more and gives you a deeper understanding than having gone through something like that, or in the case of a cardiologist, having a heart episode and so forth. That was a very instructive
So
experience.
true.
Have you had any experiences like this? Any major experiences that have made you rethink, personal experiences? I don't necessarily want to push you and make it too personal, but Have you had any kind of experiences that made you take a step back and made you appreciate or made you look at your work a little bit differently?
Oh, well, I think most of us in the healing profession, let's call it that broadly, come to it in many ways. I mentioned earlier the wounded healer, and it derives from the old concept of the shaman, the individual in the community who goes through a wounding and through their own restoration and recovery and rejuvenation and comes out the other end and then turns to service to the community through their own understanding and their own learning. And I think many, many of us in this field have gone through those experiences and then really transform and make a commitment to serving others.
I mentioned after I gave your intro that there was one thing I was going to come back to or actually bring up that I did not allude to, which is your background as a filmmaker. So tell our listeners a little bit about that work.
Well, I began my early studies in filmmaking, and then when I arrived in Mexico, I just shifted into a whole other path, and path that I've been on for all these many years, with never forgetting my passion for filmmaking. And so I've had the opportunity the last several years to go back to documentary filmmaking. And so I've made three shorts with my cinematographer, and one was about the tree called Capomo. It's called Searching for Capomo, and it's about a very special food tree, meaning it's a tree that is endemic to Mexico and Central America. It gives medicine, it gives food, and it's threatened by climate change. And so this documentary that we made in the community is about the history of this tree and how it's traditionally used and how that use is being lost to the current generation. And then we did a film about our medical massage for diabetes project that we do in rural communities. And that reflects a work that we do training massage therapists to deliver care to people who've had not just diabetes, but stroke in very rural indigenous populations. And we talked about the epidemic of diabetes and how we see preventing and treating it. And then the most recent film, it was done in the Pacific Northwest, working with indigenous populations, and that's called Salal, Cedar, and Spruce. And the medical massage film is called Cradling the Heart. But Salal, Cedar, and Spruce is all about the indigenous food sovereignty revitalization movement that's going on all over the world. But in this particular case, we focused on the Pacific Northwest, where we've been part of that process. I'm very excited because I just finished my first feature film, a 95-minute film. And that is a very different story. That is about a little remembered story it's called Breakpoint. And I've got the trailer out, but we're in film festival mode right now. And so the film is not yet available. The others are. This film is about, as I say, a little remembered or a little known story of an indigenous uprising in Canada in 1980 when Pierre Trudeau threatened to repatriate or patriate the Canadian Constitution and eliminate the rights and the resources of Indigenous peoples, First Nations people in Canada. And Canadian First Nations people organized really an uprising to take trains, hence the Constitution Express, across Canada and then on to Europe. And it actually was the foundation for the later work that was done at the United Nations and the development of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so it tells that story. What we did is we went back and interviewed people who were there 40 years later, who are now in their late 70s, and some who've since passed on. So we've got archival footage as well.
Wow. So I'm assuming you wrote and directed?
Co-wrote it with my co-author, and we're very excited that Peter Coyote agreed to do
Narrated
the
it?
narration. Yeah,
Wow, that's major.
as a gift to us. He was so committed to the story, so we were very pleased because, of course, his voice is like butter, and
Has he been on several of the Ken Burns
he is the
books?
Ken Burns voice. He is, yeah.
That's major.
Yeah, and co-directed it. So it's a family affair, as it were.
So now you're taking it to some festival. So it's done. It's now you're just
It's
taking it.
finished, just finished it, and we've got it in festival mode, and we're looking for distribution. Maybe it'll be educational documentary, maybe it'll be otherwise. It's, we're passionate about the story. I like to say you really have to sit back and get into long form listening, old style storytelling to watch a 90-minute documentary in which you listen to the story and you listen to people's stories and the story of this really momentous event.
A good story is a good story is a good story, so long as it's well told. And where could our listeners check out the trailer?
The trailer is on the Center for World Indigenous Studies website, along with a couple of the other films and all the trailers. And
So
so
your other
if
shorts
you
are there too.
Yes, we've got two shorts there. We've just re-upped and reissued the Salal film. So all of the trailers are there. Two of the shorts are there. And then we're reissuing. We won at a couple of film festivals for the Salal movie, and we're going to reissue it. We just updated it, and that'll go back into circulation.
Any designs for another feature length documentary?
Well, I'm still recovering from this one, believe me. Where next I'm going to turn my attention, even though my son, who actually is a musician, and Steve Scalfati, formerly of the James Corden Show, did the music, and the music is gorgeous in this film. They're sci-fi fans. I said, I don't know whether we're going to go in that direction, but we're next working on a short about this mythic insect in the jungle that is known to bite people. And there's all kinds of stories about this insect. So that's what we're working on next.
So mythic meaning it is, we don't know if it's for real. What is sort of the
It's
Bigfoot of
real.
insects? Oh, it
It's
is real.
real. What it is still remains unclear. Lots of stories.
You know what? That is an excellent cliffhanger on which to end this conversation.
Very good.
So might have to have you back to talk about this feature length doc. It may be a little bit far field for the catalyst, but it really is fascinating. Leslie, I really was looking forward to this. It's an excellent conversation, and you're an extraordinary human being doing extraordinary work. I really appreciate this.
Oh, Charles, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
Today I spoke with Dr. Leslie Korn, an integrative medicine clinician, scientist, educated author, and filmmaker who specializes in the intersection of mental health and chronic physical illness. For more on Chestnut Health Systems, visit chestnut.org. This is Charles Epstein for the Catalyst Podcast. Thanks for listening.